Abe.
All right, great. Thank you very much, and just want to thank the Israeli Competition Authority and Barak and the Tel Aviv Law School for putting together a great and stimulating conference. I want to sort of maybe shift gears a little bit because thinking about rather than sort of unilateral dominant firm conduct itself, thinking about how we evaluate it. That's sort of the kind of thing I've been thinking about lately, and this is a nice time to expand on some ideas I've had for several years about maybe ways in which in the U.S. I think in most jurisdictions we evaluate this sort of conduct and wondering as to whether it's really the right way to do it. Right. So one issue that I've always thought about is the way we think about pro-competitive effects and anti-competitive effects separately. Right. So in the standard paradigm, the government or the plaintiff brings a prima facie case of anti-competitive effects, and only after that do we then think about the defendant's rebuttal with pro-competitive effects. Now, it may be that in many cases, from a sort of technological standpoint, if you will, pro-competitive effects and anti-competitive effects are separate. But I think from an evidentiary standpoint, once we sort of take as given that firms only do things that maximize their profits, right? That in fact there's a great interrelation from an evidentiary standpoint between pro-competitive and anti-competitive effects, right? So at sort of the most basic and obvious level, if a firm can't offer a plausible pro-competitive argument for why it's taken some action, right? That I think tells us a lot if we operate under the assumption that firms only take profitable actions, that there must be some significant anti-competitive effect, and that should affect the way we judge the evidence of anti-competitive effects. It doesn't necessarily imply the other way, right? We could imagine there's plausible pro-competitive effects along with plausible anti-competitive effects, at which point we have to engage in some sort of way of weighing it. But I think sort of the main insight, at least that I get from this, is that I don't think it makes sense to analyze these things separately. That I think that the evidence and discussion of pro-competitive effects needs to come up at the initial stage because the the evidentiary interrelationship between the two. And so that's kind of one thing that I've been thinking about. Other thing I've sort of thought about for a while is the way that antitrust law seems to rely in many cases on proxies rather than going after sort of the direct question of interest, right? So one example of that from the recent American Express decision is when Justice Thomas talks about how we can't really look at competitive effects until we've defined a market, right? Whereas sort of the main thing that we're interested in here is this action anti-competitive? If we have direct evidence of anti-competitive effects, why do we need to necessarily engage in market definition? Another example of this is in our sort of predatory pricing jurisprudence in the United States. We have these two standards. The price has to be below cost. There has to be a dangerous probability of recoupment. These aren't the real question of interest if we're thinking about anti-competitive effects, right? What we want to know is this pricing policy, pricing practice engaged in by a dominant firm likely to, more likely to exclude rivals or deter entry versus its effect of, trying to limit that would deter aggressive competition that we want to support, right? So I guess it's sort of a general framework for thinking about this, right? If we want to use a proxy rather than sort of going after the direct question of interest, it seems like there's sort of three conditions that would need to be satisfied sort of to some greater or lesser degree, right? So the first would be that the proxy, and I think this is kind of the standard rationale for using these proxies, would have to be somehow simpler or easier to determine or more accurate, we can determine it more accurately than sort of going after the direct question of interest. Second condition, I think, is that the proxy has to be reasonably well correlated with what our direct question of interest is, right? It has to be that these proxies actually tell us something reasonable about the likelihood of anti-competitive effects. And the third one is that the proxies can't be easily gained or need to have sort of reasonable incentive effects on underlying behavior. And I think in a lot of cases that these sorts of proxies, certainly there hasn't really ever been any comprehensive, coherent argument for why they satisfy these conditions. And I think a lot of them, it's somewhat questionable, right? So think about, predatory pricing, for example. Certainly, as Louis Kapler has mentioned, the recruitment requirement, I think, isn't particularly diagnostic at all, right? The recruitment requirement essentially is just one of profit maximization, right? If it is the case that you're engaging in some action that isn't, currently profitable, right? Well, it must be that you're doing it because you expect to earn that back at some point down the road, right? What might be more diagnostic would be not whether or not you can recoup. So we assume that you wouldn't take it if you couldn't expect to recoup at some point down the road. Would be what's the mechanism of recoupment, right? Is the mechanism of recoupment that you're moving down the learning curve, right? That you're exposing your product to a wider range of consumers, or is it that you're somehow affecting the competitive landscape in the future to your advantage, right? I think similarly, the requirement of price being below cost is not, it's not necessarily that diagnostic in terms of the likely effects. And there's some argument for it in terms of the concern about chilling pro-competitive price reductions if we think that price is below cost, or it's not necessarily part of any equilibrium in a sort of a short-run price competition game. But again, if we have issues of moving down a learning curve or something like that, doesn't necessarily suggest that it's necessarily even wouldn't be part of a short-run profit, or not a short run, but at least a competitive profit maximization scheme. And certainly pricing below cost, and this is something that I think Aaron has written about, certainly isn't a necessary condition for predation having anti-competitive effects, right? So I think this is sort of one area where I don't think that these proxies necessarily or particularly were well correlated with our underlying questions of interest, and maybe more direct evaluation of what is the actual likely competitive effects of some, of what we might think of as potentially predatory pricing is a better way to do it. And I think more broadly, I guess the point that I'd like to make here is that when we do use proxies, right, I think they need to be much better justified, and there should probably be a greater presumption for directly looking at competitive effects rather than trying to look through these other proxies, which may or may not be easier to evaluate. When they are easier to evaluate, they may or may not be that well correlated with with our sort of underlying question of interest, which is what is the competitive effects, and also in some circumstances might not have the same sort of incentive properties that that we want, right? I mean, even sort of the main rationale for prices below cost is we don't want to chill competitive price cuts, but to the extent that cost isn't easily verifiable, right? It's not clear that it necessarily even achieves that goal, because if there's if cost could be measured with some error, there's always going to be some incentive not to cut your price if there's a price cost test, because whatever the lower the price that you have, right, the greater the risk that the court will find the price to be below cost. So I guess again, more generally, I think we need to have sort of a clearer and more coherent justification for proxies, and maybe a stronger default in favor of looking at the direct question of interest, even if in some ways it's potentially more